This is a very exciting moment because I get to introduce to you somebody who is going to have a huge impact on the future of our country. He's our next United States Senator from the state of Pennsylvania. His name is Dave McCormick. Now here's what you should know. So Dave has a great story. I can't think of anybody better qualified to serve us, to represent us in the United States Senate than Dave McCormick. Here's a guy that was raised by two hardworking parents and worked on his family farm as a kid, did great in high school, was an outstanding student and athlete in high school, a great football player and also a great wrestler. He was selected to go to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And he didn't just stop there. He had an outstanding career at West Point and then went into the service, the military service, served our country overseas, put his life on the line for all the rest of us, clearing minefields and the like, leading men overseas, won a bronze medal for his service overseas to keep all of us safe, and then came back home and started a business in the Pittsburgh area, a tech startup, and hired hundreds of people in Pittsburgh and succeeded by the sweat of his brow and using his intellect in that business. And along the way, of course, was asked to come back to D.C. and to serve the country, which he did so well as the National Security Advisor for our country, helping to protect our interests around the world. And then he was the CEO of a large and successful investment firm here in the country. And guess what? He can't think of anything better to do than to serve his fellow Pennsylvanians. He's a seventh-generation Pennsylvanian, by the way, to serve his fellow Pennsylvanians in the United States Senate. It's a sacrifice, but it's one that he feels is so worthy of all of you. I'm delighted to introduce to you our next United States Senator from the state of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Dave McCormick.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for that great intro. I appreciate it. All right, thank you. It's good to see everybody. Thank you for coming out today. Lots of friends in the audience, thank you. Thank you for being here. I always feel bad when I'm dressed up with these things. Let me start by saying I apologize for being overdressed. The new uniform in the Senate is hoodies and sweatshorts, right? So here's the problem, Pennsylvania. You have one senator who won't wear a suit and another senator who's an empty suit, right? That's the problem. And that's what we got to fix. That's what we got to fix. I know many of you, so I won't, and Joe did a nice job on my background, but the thing you need to know is I am a seventh-generation Pennsylvanian. My dad was born in Indiana County. My mom was born in Punxsutawney. I like to say Punxsutawney because it reminds me of Punxsutawney Phil and Punxsutawney Bob, who only pops his head up every 6 years for election years. And I was born in Washington County, and I grew up in Columbia County. Columbia County, where my folks had a farm. My dad worked at the college, was the president of the Bloomsburg State College, and I baled hay and trimmed Christmas trees. For those of you from that area, I was a busboy at the McGee Hotel. I delivered papers, and I wrestled and played football and hunted, and wrestling got me to West Point. And West Point kind of changed my life and opened up the world to me, allowed me to serve the country in Iraq, and then gave me the leadership, I think, to come back. And West Point is duty, honor, country. That's what you'll learn there, and that's a big part of my life. Some of you know Dina. My wife is Egyptian. She was born in Egypt as a Coptic Christian, and her family moved to America when she was only 5, so they could practice their religious freedom. And she worked her way through the University of Texas. Her dad worked as a mechanic, couldn't speak English, worked as a mechanic and mowed lawns. And she got to work for 2 presidents, President Bush and President Trump, had a great business career. So she and I look at each other and we say, oh my God, only in America could these kinds of stories exist, only in America. And that America we love, that America we know is slipping away, and that, my friends, is why I'm running for office. That is why you're here. We all feel it. And so this decision was hard in some ways to run again. You know, I lost by 900 votes of 1.5 million cast. That's a gut check. It makes you question, you know, what you really want to do. But if you believe America is the greatest country in the world, if you believe that it's given you everything that it's given us, if you believe it's in deep, deep trouble, and you believe that you can do something about it, that is the time to jump into the ring, and that is why I'm running for the Senate. That's why I'm so glad to be here today. So thank you. Now I'm gonna tell you what you already know, but it's important to just take stock of where we are. We're in deep trouble in the following ways. Economically, when I see President Biden get up there and talk about Bidenomics working, I say, oh my God, that's not what I see traveling across the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. 60% of Pennsylvanians, 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. And due to the unbelievable spending policies of Joe Biden, and Bob Casey, by the way, who's voted for every spending bill, as well as the energy policy, we've had inflation, which has driven up prices by 18%. 18%. And wages have gone up by about 14%. So if you're somebody who's living paycheck to paycheck, and you're going to buy food or rent or fuel, you're getting squeezed in the last 3 years. Life is getting harder and harder. Interest rates have gone up, so if you want to buy a new pickup truck, it's about 60% more expensive. If you want to buy a new home, it's about twice as much as it used to be. So this economy, despite what Joe Biden says, isn't working for most of Pennsylvania. And it's the direct result of bad policies, constraining the development of fossil fuels here in Pennsylvania, which has driven up the price of fuel. It's the result of this spending. Republicans and Democrats alike have been spending too much for 20 years. If you looked at a chart, it's like this, but under Joe Biden, it's a hockey stick. The spending is wildly out of control. $34 trillion of debt, $1 trillion of interest a year. We spend more on interest than we spend on our defense. It's a crisis, and we need new leadership to deal with that, and you can thank Joe Biden and Bob Casey. But it's not just the economy. You know, when I started the campaign, October 1st, I'd go around, every room I'd go into, I'd say, give me the 3 big issues. And the 3 big issues would be economy, they'd be border, and usually crime. Guess what? Border is #1 right now. And of course it is. If we were sitting in a room together on the first day of the Joe Biden administration, when we knew he was going to overturn Trump's policies, and we said to ourselves, how bad could it get? It's gotten so much worse than we could have ever imagined, right? This is unbelievable. 10 million illegal migrants that have entered our country. That places huge burdens of social services. It's destroying our cities, the sanctuary cities. But just think about the national security risk of this. The national security risks are incredible. So we have millions of people that we don't know who they are or how they got here that have crossed our borders. 160 of them in 2023 were apprehended who were on the terrorist watch list. These are people that are on the terrorist. Those are the ones that were apprehended. 13 people took the towers down on 9/11. And we've got 160 and hundreds more who are on the terrorist watch list that are in our country. And then you think about the fentanyl crisis, which is a direct result of the open border. So we lost 4,000 Pennsylvanians last year to fentanyl. 4,000. Almost 100,000 in America last year from fentanyl. I think these numbers are so big that people aren't digesting what this means. To put it in perspective, for those of you who were around during Vietnam, 8 years of Vietnam, we lost about 50,000 Americans. In 20 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, we lost about 5,000 killed in action. 100,000 last year because of the failed policies of Joe Biden. And guess who's voted with him every step of the way? Bob Casey voted for sanctuary cities. Bob Casey, who voted against more money for the Border Patrol. Bob Casey, who voted against an initiative to close the flow of opioids and fentanyl into our country. Bob Casey, who voted against Kate's Law, which would allow us to prosecute illegal migrants who commit a felony, leave the country, and come back. So we have an unsecure border that's a disaster for America, and you can thank Joe Biden and Bob Casey. We have crime that's spiraling out of control. In Philadelphia and Pittsburgh where I live, I met with the FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police in Pittsburgh, a couple weeks ago. In 2020, there were 1,000 people on the police force in Pittsburgh. Today, there's 750 on the way to 650. They can't hire them fast enough. When people are eligible for retirement, they're leaving. In my neighborhood in Pittsburgh, in Squirrel Hill, we used to have 6 police cars patrolling at night. We now have 2. If you have a crime happen and you call the police, unless it's a crime in progress, they don't come. You file your police report telephonically. This is the state of our cities, and Philadelphia is even worse. Those of you who live near or around Philadelphia, all-time high murder rate. Larry Krasner, this liberal prosecutor supported by Soros, has put in place a policy: if you steal less than $1,000, you're not prosecuted. Can you believe it? So of course the crooks are going in and shoplifting. They add up how much they're stealing. If it's under 1,000, they're not going to get prosecuted. I was in Chester County, I don't know, a couple months ago. I walked into a sporting goods store. There was a woman proprietor. I said, how are sales? She said, gun sales are big, high. I said, who's buying? Women. 60% of the sales are women buying handguns because they're worried about the violent crime coming from Philadelphia into the suburbs, and it is. We have the war on energy policy, which I talked about. I mean, it is a terrible state of things. But the scariest thing of all for me is the spiritual decline. So only about a third of Americans, young Americans, only about a third of our young people think America's exceptional. Only about a third are very patriotic. Only a third. And then you see those kids on campuses, and they don't know the difference between right and wrong. And they don't know good versus evil. And you got Jewish kids at the University of Pennsylvania who are staying in their rooms because they're afraid that they'll be attacked if they go on a campus. And you say, my God, how could that happen on the campuses of our greatest universities in the country? And then you watch those 3 college presidents testify, and you say, oh, that's how it happened. Right? The lack of leadership, the lack of moral clarity that is failing us across our country. And as scary as all those things are, in many ways it might even be scarier when you look outside our borders. Dina and I went to Israel right after Christmas. We went to Kfar Aza, which is one of the communities that was attacked on October 7th. 800 residents, 100 of them were butchered on that day. I mean, decapitations, families burned, parents killed in front of their kids. Pure evil. You can't believe this could exist. You think it's a horror movie, but then of course you know it's not. And that evil, Hamas focused on Israel, was not just for Israel, that's for the West. And not just Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, all of these terrorist proxies, and they're attacking Americans across the Middle East, and the original sin is Iran. The deal we did with Iran where we gave them back $100 billion in 2015, Obama, Biden, and guess who? The deciding vote, Bob Casey. And that's creating a risk for America that we've not seen the end of. It's Ukraine and Russia invading in Ukraine, all because of the view of America's weak and Joe Biden's weak. China rattling its saber. Listen, I'm 58 years old. I was a soldier during the Cold War, and we used to talk about nuclear annihilation. I was in the first wave of troops into Iraq. I was in the Treasury Department during the Great Recession, where we thought we were going into the Great Depression. And I've never been more scared in my adult life about the possibility of things outside of our borders taking America in a direction that we can't control. So we are in deep, deep trouble. And we've been in deep trouble before as a country. And when we got to the edge of the cliff, we pulled ourselves back. And the difference between cascading over the cliff and pulling ourselves back is leadership. That's the difference. It happened in 1979. I remember as a kid waiting in the gas line with my dad, odd days and even days to get the gas. I remember inflation was 18%, something like that, 17, 18%. We were in a recession. Iran had taken our hostages 435 days. It was the peak of the Cold War where we thought the Soviet Union was winning. 4 years later, when I was a plebe at West Point, it was morning in America. Leadership matters. I'm not saying we need Ronald Reagan or even the policies of Ronald Reagan. But what I am saying we need is leadership. And that's why this Senate seat is so important. This Senate seat gives the right leadership in Pennsylvania. It also will turn our majority in the Senate to a red majority, which under the worst case will block the progressive left from taking our country over a cliff. And under the best case, with President Trump in the White House and a Republican House, will allow us to drive an agenda to get America back on track. This Senate seat could not be more important. And everywhere I go in Pennsylvania, I feel things that make me believe, and I'm more confident than ever, that I'm going to win this election. I'm going to win this election. You know, I wouldn't have gotten in unless I thought I was going to win it, but every day that goes by, I think I'm going to win it more. And the reason I believe that is, number one, this is a change election. This is a change election. 80% of Pennsylvanians, 80% of Americans think our country is going in the wrong direction. Those aren't Republicans. Those are Republicans, Democrats, Independents. Those problems aren't Republican problems. Inflation, a chaotic border, our national security at risk, wars around the world, crime, those are problems for all Pennsylvanians. 80%, it's a change election. And if it's a change election, you want to be the challenger, not the incumbent. Not the guy that's been in office for 30 years. Not the guy who's been in the Senate for 18 that most people have never heard of. It's a change election. Number two, our party has united around me, and I am deeply grateful for that. Deeply grateful. I've had the endorsement of the party. I've had the endorsement of the congressional delegation. Everybody from Scott Perry, also an Army man, retired general now, who was the chairman of the Freedom Caucus, to Brian Fitzpatrick, who is the co-chair of the Problem Solvers Caucus. And all of them have come behind me, and they don't agree on everything, and they don't agree with me on everything. And I tell them all, listen, you're going to agree with about 80% of what I say. 80%, which is higher than I have with Dina. And I bet higher than many of you have with your spouse, right? 80%'s not bad. But we disagree 90% of the time with the crazy progressive left that's destroying our country. And we got to win to get leaders in place that can get things back on track. We are united as a party, for the most part, on the need for mail-in ballots. Listen, Act 77 is not my cup of tea either, but that's the law, and we're not going to win elections unless we close that gap. And President Trump's team, people from around the country, people from across Pennsylvania have united on this. There's millions of dollars focused on this. It's something we got to embrace or we're going to lose. We got to do it. Election integrity. We've got to make sure that this election is a fair election. We got to make sure we get our best shot. There's a huge set of initiatives around making sure that everything from voting machines to drop boxes to the day of the election to the voter rolls are screened. And most important, give people confidence that their vote's going to count. If our people don't feel like their vote's going to count, they're not going to come out to vote. We got to give them belief, confidence, right? And voter registration. Listen, we are becoming a red state. You want some good news? We're becoming a red state. In 2016, there was 1 million more registered Democrats than Republicans. It's about 395,000 today, and it's going south. By election day, I hope we're 300,000. Like, we are becoming a red state, and we can win elections if we run smart elections and are united as a party. That's the second reason I'm going to win, is because we're united. The third reason I'm going to win is when you push people, when you get past inflation and the border, and you say, what do we really need? You know what they say? We need leadership. We need leadership. And my opponent is everything but a leader. This guy is the son of a famous governor, and that is his calling card, right? He has not, in his 30 years in public life, has done virtually nothing. In his 18 years in the Senate, and I challenge all of you, go look at what my dad calls the Google machine, and you will soon find that he has not accomplished a single thing in the Senate. He's not led on anything. But don't think his lack of leadership hasn't been a disaster for Pennsylvanians, because he has voted 98% of the time with Joe Biden. Bob Casey is not a leader. Bob Casey is a follower, and he is following Joe Biden and the progressive left over the cliff. All those things I talked about. All those things. Inflation, crisis at the border, crime. Bob Casey last week took an endorsement from Indivisible Philadelphia, a radical group that wants to defund the police. Every step of the way, this guy has gotten more and more out of touch with Pennsylvania, more and more aligned with the progressive left. He's a leader. He's a follower, not a leader, at a time when we need leaders. And the final thing I'll say is, I can feel the energy. I can feel the movement coming together on the campaign trail. People are scared. People are frightened. 2/3 of us, myself included, believe our kids are going to be less well off than we are. I was at State College about a month or so ago, and I'll end by saying to you what I said to them. First thing I said is, you've not been around that long. Many in this room have been around a lot longer. How many times have you heard politicians say, this is the most important election of your lifetime, right? How many times? Always, right? Every time. But I want to ask you to think back on all those times and think about this time. And was there ever a moment where America felt so fragile? Was there ever a time that the consequences of getting it wrong seemed so profound? Was there ever a moment when you felt so helpless to change the direction of the country and where you were so fearful that the America you love is slipping away? I don't think so. So this may be the one time It is the most important election of your lifetime, right? Second thing I'll say to you, which I said to them, is, and I said this, it was about 50 kids at Penn State. I think it was all the Republicans at Penn State. And I said, listen, guys, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be okay either way. No matter what happens in this election, I'm going to be okay. Because I got more years behind me than in front of me. Like a lot of people here. Most of us in this room have more years behind us than in front of us. But then I said to them, but you're not going to be okay. You are not going to be okay. You young people are not on a path to being okay. Our kids are not going to be okay unless we change the direction of this country. We're not going to be okay. And so I say to them and I say to you, you need to treat this election like your life depends on it. Because it does. Thanks so much for having me today. It's good to be with you. Good to see you. Thanks, Charlie. How long did I go?
A while.
What was it?
We'll be okay.
I think Joe told me I went a little too long.
No, you're fine. This is who they're here to see. Let me introduce myself. My name is Joel Natalie. I'm the station manager and talk show host at Talk Erie Radio in Erie, Pennsylvania. And I want to go rapid fire here, Dave, because let's talk about action and what's going to be the effective message when we talk about economy, inflation, and the cost of living. What's the winning message for you?
Winning message is Joe Biden and Bob Casey are to blame. They own the dilemma that most Pennsylvanians are feeling, and we need smart policies that dramatically cut spending and energy policies that unlocks the enormous potential of Pennsylvania. That's the best way to create opportunity for Pennsylvanians and the best way to get ourselves out of the economic ditch that Biden and Casey have put us in.
Do you think that those kinds of movement could bring some population back to Pennsylvania? Because we have an issue with our economy is dependent upon population, and we're declining in population.
Well, I think most people know this, but if you could do one thing, just one thing in Pennsylvania that would change it dramatically, it would be natural gas. Yeah. Our natural gas, we're the fourth largest. If Pennsylvania were a country, we would be the fourth largest natural gas reserves in the world. Yeah. And that natural gas, the benefit of that is not just good for the counties that it's in. That's a huge opportunity for all of Pennsylvania. If we had sensible regulations and opportunity to drill, if we had pipeline reform, permitting, that would allow us to get that natural gas to neighboring states, if we had an offshore port that would allow us to export that natural gas around the world, that's hundreds of thousands of jobs. And these are great paying jobs. I mean, these are great paying jobs, great opportunity. I was in Tunkhannock at Lackawanna College for petroleum and natural gas last week. I mean, these kids are graduating at the age of 19, 20. They're making 60 grand a year. And when they go in overtime, they're making 80. And they're very technical jobs that have huge opportunity. This is the one thing we could do that helps our national security, helps our economy, and it helps our environment. And Biden and Casey have completely screwed this up because they've been hijacked by the crazy green movement.
Let's talk about immigration. What can you do in the Senate to right the immigration?
Well, the number one thing, we talked about fentanyl. I hammered that. Listen, I'm going to say something which may be controversial. As a military guy, I always am reluctant to use the military. We need to use our military to take out the cartels, right? That is, we have the technology. We've got 20 years of perfecting that with war in Iraq and Afghanistan. We're pinpoint technology with the drones. We've got incredible special forces. We did this 20 years ago with Colombia and during the cocaine wars. This is killing 100,000 Americans. So I would surgically take out the cartels. We might do that with the Mexican government. If the Mexican government is compromised by the cartels, we might just do it on our own. But this is a huge national security threat.
Let's talk about crime a second. The mayor of Philadelphia just put a curfew at Kensington. I mean, they're nibbling at the edges. What would you do?
Listen, first of all, you got to get rid of these crazy prosecutors. You got to prosecute criminals and put them in jail and hold them accountable for terrible behavior, right? So that's what. But listen, I'm a guy who wore a uniform. I wasn't a man or woman in blue. But we've got to respect these people in uniform. They're doing an enormous service to our society. They have to be adequately funded. They have to have qualified immunity. They have to have leaders that have their backs. They can't have leaders like Bob Casey that support defunding the police. They can't have leaders that say the problem is systematic racism across all of our police forces. You can't have a viable police force unless you have leaders that stand with it. And so that's our biggest problem. Bob Casey has been weak on this from day one. You talk to the cops, 47 sheriffs across Pennsylvania, county sheriffs have endorsed me. Every one of them says the same thing. We can't hire fast enough. Nobody wants to be a cop anymore because it's dangerous, you don't get respect, you're not adequately funded. That's the beginning of the end. When you think about law and order as a basic building block of community, of business, of safe families, we got to get this back on track, and it's all about leadership, and Bob Casey's shown none of it.
There's a bridge between the immigration crisis and crime. In our county, in Erie County, I interviewed the coroner. He said every one of his overdose cases were related to fentanyl. Yeah. Is there a way to, put a stop to the fentanyl?
Yeah. Well, three things. One, that fentanyl is starting in China. So those ingredients are coming from China to Mexico. So what's the Biden administration doing? They're negotiating with the Chinese to try to get their hands around the problem. No, you interdict the ships. You treat this like it's poison coming in your country, because it is. That's the first thing. Second thing you do is you go after the cartels in Mexico, the way I described with the military. Third thing you do, and don't let any of what is being said in the news change what's true, which is that Joe Biden has in his authorities the ability to close down the border and secure the border. Trump did it. Biden's not doing it. And you remember that when you go to the county fair, sometimes you'll see the guy with the 3 walnuts, and there'll be a pea, and they're trying to move the pea. That's exactly what's happening right now. Biden is trying to shirk his responsibility for an unbelievable crisis at the border. He's trying to shirk his responsibility for inflation. And the guy that's shirking with him is Bob Casey. That is exactly what's happening. That's what's happening on shrinkflation, greedflation. The idea that Bob Casey voted for everything and Joe Biden created this inflation crisis that's destroying our working families, that's theirs, and they're trying to blame it on somebody else. That is the opposite of what we need from leadership. Leaders hold themselves accountable. They take responsibility when they screw things up. Biden and Casey have screwed up our country royally, and they need to own it.
National media is saying this Senate race is the most important in America. Let's deal with what your opponent, Senator Casey, will be attacking you with in this campaign. Here's a quote from a campaign release I received. Dave McCormick isn't out of touch, he's out of state. Now, these base voters here are looking for a W from you because they're distraught after that 2022 open seat loss. So how do you plan on fighting that attack?
Well, you start with you're going to get attacked on something, right? That's the nature of this business. This is a pretty good one for me, I think. I want this, because let's have that debate, right? 7th generation Pennsylvanian. Grew up here. All-state football. 4th in the states in wrestling. Left to serve my country for 9 years. In the military, in combat. Bronze Star. Came back to Pennsylvania. Created 600 jobs in Pittsburgh. Went back into public service. And then, I had a chapter of my life, like many Pennsylvanians, where I ran a company outside of Pittsburgh. Or outside of Pennsylvania, rather. I kept my farm, kept my friends and my family. My mom and dad still lived here. And then am back here to serve, live in Pittsburgh, have a family farm. I think that's what we want from our kids. We want our kids to have success, and we want people who are successful to lead our country in public service. And so the way I'm going to handle this, I'm going to own every part of my career and my success. I'm proud of it. I have nothing to apologize for. I am divorced. I have 6 daughters, 4 daughters, and 2 stepdaughters. They're 23 to 17. People say, this political stuff must be so hard. I said, if you've had 6 teenagers in the house at the same time, women, this is easy, right? This is easy. But one of my daughters is with her mom in Connecticut, so I fly back periodically to Connecticut to see my daughter, and I'm going to do that like any good dad would, and that's how I'm going to run the campaign. The reason I think they're focused on this is it worked for Oz. It worked against Oz. it's a lot harder to make that work against me. And so I think that'll be the response.
Last question.
And by the way, if you have the record that Bob Casey has, if you've been 30 years in public office and haven't done anything, if you've been living off the public dole for 30 years, if you're part of this dynasty where you think you just get to be in office because your dad was a famous governor, that's what you do. You point to the other people who are successful. I'd say, okay, let's have that conversation about who's best prepared to lead our country. I'll say one more thing, which is when I'm on the campaign trail, I say the following. If you are more or less satisfied with the direction of things, if you think the status quo is okay, do not vote for me. I am not your guy. I believe we're in deep trouble. I believe we need change. I'm not going there to be a senator. I've had better jobs than being a senator, to be honest with you. I'm going there to make change happen. If I win this race and come back for a visit 2 years from now and haven't made change happen, then I will have failed you. This is all about fighting for change. Bob Casey's the status quo. I'm change.
Last question. Yeah. You know, cities like Erie were the land that left behind, but we're experiencing a renaissance now because of a lot of investment by our private sector. You talk a lot about servant leadership in your book. Talk about bringing hope to communities like Erie, like Scranton, like Harrisburg.
Yeah, this is a basic thing about leadership, in my opinion. And I'm not putting myself up on a pedestal as a perfect leader, but leaders do two things at the same time. They are brutally honest about the reality. This is our reality, everybody. Like, you got to embrace reality. You can't convince people something's true that's not true. But then you lay out a vision for where our country can go, where our Commonwealth can go, a vision for the future that's credible. So all the great leaders that I've had a chance to work with, the leader I try to be, they have 4 qualities. Number 1, they lay out that vision. Number 2, they're courageous. They're willing to speak truth. They're willing to stand up and take personal risk. When was the last time Bob Casey took personal risk? They take personal risk because there's no decision, no thing I could do that everybody's going to agree with. The third thing they do, they're humble. Leaders are humble because, man, I've lived it. I've been fired. I've had high-profile failures. Nobody's perfect. It's a constant. Life is about learning and growing and leading, and so leaders are humble because they you don't have all the answers. You have to draw on others. And the fourth thing that leaders do, they care deeply about the people that they're seeking to lead. It's not about them. If a leader thinks it's about them, then they're not a good leader. It's about those that you're seeking to serve. And I've learned those lessons over many years in the military and in business, and that's what I think we need at this moment. People that are willing to lay out a vision, stand with courage, learn from their mistakes with humility and care. And I think if we have that, we're going to get our country on the right track again.
Appreciate it, Dave.
Thank you. Thank you all.